My first experience was when I was 19 or 20, in college, and 3 days after being terrified in the theater watching The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Perfect. I will never forget the experience. I woke up, so I thought, and looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. exactly. I felt a looming, very dark, evil presence in my room and realized I was completely paralyzed. With the exception of my head, this is part of the hallucination. I now know that in all actuality I was hallucinating being able to move my head and look around the room. Then it started. I had a lovely white, extremely fluffy white down comforter pulled all the way up to my chin. I felt the extreme pressure on my chest. I felt something pushing me into my bed, suffocating me. When I looked down, I saw a huge impression in my comforter where I felt the pressure, and saw it getting deeper, pushing me down further. I tried to scream when I heard the bed springs squeak under me, as whatever this thing was pushed and pushed. I couldn't speak. The best I could get out was hushed gargling. I then felt like there was pressure on my neck, choking me. I can't express how deeply terrified I was. I couldn't move a single muscle in my body. My arms felt like they were too heavy to lift. I couldn't sit up, despite trying with every bit of strength I had. I, at the time, considered myself agnostic or atheist or whatever college students who think God is for stupid people say that they are, and I actually thought there was a demon on my chest, trying to either kill me or possess me. I thought it would never end, and it seemed to last forever. And then, I felt myself close my eyes, and the thing was gone. I said my roommate's name to see if I could speak again. I could. I looked down at my comforter, and there was no trace of anything unusual. I immediately jumped out of my bed, hysterically crying, trembling, and scared the shit out of my roommate when I woke her up this way. I spent the rest of the night sleepless, in her bed. I was completely traumatized, and so was my roommate. The next day, this happened. Yep, that's me, and my bed that I moved right next to my roommate's. I'm a big baby. But so was she, so it was okay. It stayed this way until the end of the year. We moved her desk into my room and made it the office. I couldn't sleep in my room alone again. I didn't experience another attack for about a year, but the next time it happened a lot. Each experience was a bit different during that first phase of episodes. I experienced violent shaking of my bed, to wake up to a dark figure standing to the right of my bed, physically shaking it. Another time, I felt my bed turning over, and felt myself sliding off, or being pulled off, along with my covers, and not being able to hold on and keep myself from sliding due to the paralysis. Other times I felt like I was being held in whatever position I woke up in and was having a seizure. Now, I tend to experience a lot of these at once, along with a floating feeling where I can't move myself, but I'm being lifted, or parts of me are being lifted by something else. I see things moving or shaking often. Tonight I woke up in the position where I was looking at a chandelier above and to the right of my bed, and felt like my head was being pushed that direction by whatever was to the left of my bed, but I couldn't direct my eyes to whatever it was just out of vision. But as I looked at the chandelier, it was swinging back and forth. I had the seizure sensation in my whole face, and my upper body was being lifted, up and down. Oh, and I thought it was storming outside. It wasn't. Every episode one tried to scream. I don't exactly know why, as at this point, I know good and well nothing more than a faint gurgle will come out, but it's not something I can control. The panic completely consumes me. I'm much more educated about what I'm actually experiencing now, after 7 years of dealing with it, but I can never shake the panic. After the episodes I experience now, I'm much more clear-headed about what just happened than I was as a 20-year-old who felt like a demon had it out for her, but it's still terrifying. The hallucinations, in that moment, seem as real as can be. I stay quite scared and lonely for a while after, and almost exhausted from trying to fight the paralysis and panic. I continue to see shadows and think things are moving around me a few minutes following, and that looming feeling tends to stick around for a moment, as well. For me, these episodes happen in phases, due to stress and lack of sleep, for the most part. When I do experience an isolated incident, It is usually on a night I've had a lot of trouble falling asleep, as was the case tonight. I laid in bed for hours, tossing and turning, and the minute I realized I was asleep, those who have these will recognize that moment, I think, I woke up to paralysis. I've experienced episodes while dozing off to sleep, but usually I am woken up by them after dozing. The paralysis I've experienced while drifting into a doze is usually less frightening because the hallucinations are not as present, it's more just the paralysis and trouble breathing. But I tend to come out of it, and then fall right back into paralysis multiple times before being able to actually sleep when this is the case. But I prefer that over the hallucinations, 100x over. Sleep paralysis has been the source of some of the most terrifying experiences of my life, particularly before I was able to figure out what was happening to me, but after I've learned about the disorder as well, as I am overwhelmed by my panic in each hallucination. I come to after, but during that time, I'm almost always just as terrified as the time before. About 7 years ago I got an invitation to attend my cousin's dinner party. I had never seen my cousin before and only spoke to him on the phone. I was surprised that his family unexpectedly invited me after all these years. The invitation had an uncharted address that the GPS was unfamiliar with. I used a map and pinned its location. As I'm driving, I tend to notice how far I ventured off from civilization. Trees after trees, farms after farms. Where the fuck am I going? I finally found a similar address that might be it. Approaching the house, I notice how dull and dreary it looks. It's completely engulfed with leaves and branches. This can't be it, I said to myself. As soon as I entered the rocky driveway, my aunt and uncle came out to greet me. They seemed excited and welcoming. Walking into the house, I asked where my cousin is. Answering immediately, "He went to run a few errands. He should be back later." We spent the whole couple of hours talking about my mother and family. My aunt made delicious homemade pot roast that I finished off in minutes. After dinner, we played an enduring game of Uno. It was surprisingly fun and competitive. When we finished Uno, it was almost dark and still no sign of my cousin. Regardless, I had to leave. It was almost dark and I would have trouble getting out of this dreadful place. My GPS was ineffective, so I asked my aunt and uncle the most efficient way onto the highway. They gave me a puzzled look. "I thought you were staying the night." I told them I couldn't because I had work tomorrow and couldn't afford to miss another day. "It's much better if you leave tomorrow morning. Trust me, you'll get lost." I shrugged it off and told them not to worry. I'm an adept navigator. I could get out the Sahara Desert. Looking aggravated, they strongly advised me to stay the night for my own sake. At this point, I was getting pissed and irritable. I sighed, "Fine, I'll stay the night, but I have to get up early for work." Both of them seemed strangely ecstatic that I was staying the night. As soon as they went to go get my bedsheets and pillows, I ran out the door and got in my car. I hastily pulled out the driveway. It took me a while, but I found my way out that depressing place. I got home an hour later than expected. It was 11, and I didn't want to wake my parents up. Climbing my fence and entering the back door, I noticed the kitchen lights were on. As soon as I took my first step in the door, I saw my mom sitting there looking impatient. "Where were you?" she asked. "I was at Aunt Deborah's, you knew this." "Then why did she call saying you never arrived?" To this day, I never knew who I visited. This happened in a high school boys' restroom, and although maybe not scary, what happened was definitely creepy. I had diarrhea one morning, and happened to have gym first period. Somehow I managed to not have an accident, and the gym restroom had no toilet paper, so I had to wait until second period to go. Also, I might add that I didn't go between periods because there was just not enough time, nor did I go during second period because the need had subsided until later. So finally, I went to the first floor restroom during lunch, and entered, as did a group of special ed students, most of them talking gibberish. Now, I do not mean to offend these kinds of students, nor do I treat them with disrespect, but they are creepy. The restroom sounded like an asylum, and so I waited until everyone left the restroom, because I had the feeling I was going to explode and didn't want anyone to hear. Everyone eventually left, everyone except me and one kid, that is. I was in my stall, still waiting, and noticed someone was in front of it. He was staring into my eyes through the crack. I waited for about a minute, coughing and staring back, trying to give him cues that I noticed him there and that he should move. But he didn't, he just stared, waiting. I was unable to do my business, so I walked out past him to wash my hands. As I walked past him, I was able to take better notice of him. He had a small skinny face with glasses and ginger hair. As soon as I came out, he walked right in. As I washed my hands, I couldn't help but look at the mirror in front of me, which was in front of the stall. I saw him touch the toilet seat with his hands, probably to check if it was wet. Remembering having gym with diarrhea gives me chills, but more so remembering how this special ed student stared at me through the door crack, and I am thankful I didn't start pooping sooner, as he would have watched the whole thing. That was when I was a teacher. A 14-year-old pupil nobody at school ever noticed anything wrong with, who always had good grades and never caused any problems, went home on a Wednesday afternoon. He asked his mother for some money and told her he was going to see his friends. He never saw anybody, but went to the railroad, jumped in front of a train and killed himself. Nobody could believe it, there just weren't any signs. One of his classmates knew his girlfriend just broke up with him, but he never talked about it. It was only after the police had searched his computer, it became clear he couldn't handle the breakup. He had written all kinds of disturbing texts about his feelings and his plans. So we had an explanation, but none of us had ever seen someone acting completely normal on the outside, but was so broken inside that he decided to take his own life. After a few months, his parents visited the school and they told us they knew he had been going through a difficult time, but his decision was for them as unexpected as it was for us. About 3 years later, I moved to another school in the same area. I never forgot about the incident, and I always tried to tell my students how important it was to talk about how they felt, and I always mentioned the incident as an example. One day, I was teaching Dutch and we were reading a text about someone who had committed suicide. I talked about my experience and mentioned what had happened 3 years earlier. Then a girl said, "That was my brother." In my lifetime, I've seen many ghosts and or apparitions. When I was a child, these things scared me half to death, so much so that I was 10 years old before I could fall asleep in a dark room. I've been told I come from a long line of supposed sensitives. My mom labeled herself a psychic, gave readings and helped various people, including the police, find missing people. My mom was also into some really dark stuff, which turned me off to the whole idea of this type of phenomena. Unfortunately, she also a compulsive liar, who suffered from bipolar disease, Munchausen by proxy, schizoaffective disorder and paranoia, which sort of makes people less inclined to believe some of her wilder statements. Had I not witnessed some of these events with my own eyes, I'd not have believed they occurred. When I was 13, I was in a bad car wreck. I watched my mom die, and saw what I assume was her spirit exiting her body. I didn't realize it at the time, but her airway had been cut off by the force of the steering wheel against it. I remember grabbing her and shaking her until she started breathing again. After the car wreck, I was able to feel physical sensations while touching or standing next to people. Occasionally spirits would talk to me. This was all completely overwhelming. I was in my mid-20s before I was finally able to begin come to terms with my abilities. That said, I spent decades worrying that I was a psychotic nutcase. When I worked in the medical field, I could feel when patients were sick or going into cardiac arrest. I had a sense of which patient would survive and which would not. Suffice it to say, I told few people of my abilities. When I was in my 30s, my dad suffered a massive heart attack. I'd known for weeks he was ill, and tried to help him, but he wouldn't let me. The day he had his heart attack, I managed to get him to the hospital where I worked, before he went into cardiac arrest. I remember running into the ER and telling the charge nurse my dad was having an MI. Thankfully, they took him right in and placed him directly in a cardiac bed. While sitting in the nurse's lounge talking to the head nurse, I suddenly saw my dad standing in the hallway speaking with his dead parents. I looked at her and said, "I think my dad's in cardiac arrest." She gave me a hug and told me not to worry. "He was fine 5 minutes ago. I'm sure he's fine now." Then I heard "Code Blue to C1" coming over the intercom, and knew what I was seeing was real. I told no one what I'd seen that day. 2 days later, my dad, who survived his first MI, told me he'd seen his mom and dad while in cardiac arrest. He said his dad had told him it wasn't yet his time to go. Sadly, he died 3 months later. I woke up with an urgent need to see my dad. I ran into his bedroom and found him in cardiac arrest. I felt for a pulse and he had none, yet he was still breathing. Blood was pouring out of his mouth. His lungs sounded as if he had inhaled a gallon of fluid. I remember squeezing his hand and feeling him squeeze back. It was, and always will be, the single most amazing moment in my life. I knew he was dying. He knew he was dying cancer. He was scheduled to have both kidneys removed in 2 days, along with his bladder. His diagnosis was grim. If he survived, he'd be on dialysis the rest of his life. So I stopped CPR and held on to my dad. The guilt of that moment stayed with me for almost 20 years. I was still holding his hand when told him I loved him, that it was okay for him to go, that I'd take care of Mom for him. He took one last deep breath, exhaled, and went limp and still. A river of blood continued flowing from his mouth. I felt the essence of him leaving the room. I never realized how deep our connection had been, or how much I would miss feeling his energy, spirit, or whatever other name you want to give it, after he died. It was as if a door had opened, and he was still there, then closed, and he was gone. Almost 30 years later, I still miss my dad and his beautiful energy. I still hear and see things and have recorded sounds, voices, and images of apparitions in and around my home. I don't know if spirits seek me out because I can hear and or see them, or because some places are haunted. I've gradually come to terms that seeing and hearing things is part of who I am. Thankfully, enough people have been there to verify what I've seen, that I no longer worry about my sanity. I've only begun talking about my abilities to others in the past few years. I'm 60 years old. I am originally from northeastern Ohio, a very small, rural agricultural community. So small, in fact, it is from a bygone era. When I describe what the area was like in a common day from that life, young people have difficulty understanding. Our house had a full basement. Image a large square divided into sub-squares. Each had a light fixture on the ceiling, but only one, the one you entered from the stairs, had a light switch. So you can imagine being just 3.5 to 4, it was an impossibility to turn on a light. I was even too short to turn on the light switch. Even on the brightest of days, the basement was dark. It possessed a few small windows that provided some light. My father kept a guinea pig in the basement. His name was Pigger. Far from an original name, but it was cute, and it fit him well. Pigger was kept in a large, wooden cage whose door opened at the top. Only my father would retrieve Pigger from the cage for us to interact with, and only he put him back in his cage. One day I decided to venture down into the basement to visit Pigger. The lighting was far from adequate. After I literally climbed down the 2 flights of stairs, I wandered over to Pigger's place of incarceration. Much to my dismay, he was not in his cage. The door was secured, but he was not in it. I could not ascertain how he had gotten out. I began searching the basement for him. Size-wise, he was quite a formidable beast compared to my small stature. I wandered to the other side of the basement where we kept the washer, an antique that one had to feed clothes manually through rollers to wring the water from them. We hung our clothes on a clothesline outdoors or in the basement in winter. There was a good-sized drain the washer emptied into. There was a metal circular piece that fit over it to catch large particulate matter that was being sent down the drain. The cover had been removed. In the dark, I saw something come darting out of the drain and vanish behind the washer. Of course, this caused me to jump back and it frightened me. I realized it was Pigger. Whenever I would get close him, he would move away. At one point he charged me and bit me on the foot. I screamed and turned and started to run to the stairs. Unfortunately, Pigger began chasing me. He cut me off from the stairs. The only place I felt would be safe was in the cage. I crawled into the cage and shut the door. Instantly, Pigger was at the bars of the cage. He seemed to want into the cage to get at me. As an adult now, I can understand he probably bit me from fear or anger and quite possibly did want to be near me, but as a small boy that was bitten and bleeding and running from a guinea pig that has seemingly trapped me in a cage and is trying to get at me again to bite me, I was terrified. Unfortunately, my mother was away as well as my 2 older sisters. My father was outside working on our tractor. I screamed for approximately 25 minutes until my mother came into the house returning from errands when she heard the ruckus. She turned on the light as she came down the stairs and upon seeing me in the cage began laughing. She had no idea what was going on. She pulled me out of the cage and I showed her where I was bleeding. She took me upstairs and cleaned and dressed my wound. She returned to the basement and caught Pigger and placed him back in his cage. She discovered that the door lever that locked it shut on the cage was broken. She attempted to assuage my pain and fear by explaining to me that Pigger had acted as he had because he was just as afraid as I was. That did not make any difference to a boy my age. Never again did I ever attempt to touch him. That lesson has stayed with me my entire life. I have been bitten over 100 times by dogs due to a particular occupation I was engaged in. I have been bitten by cats and rats and hamsters. Fear was never an emotion I felt, nor anger. I took that lesson of another living thing being afraid, and it was just attempting to protect. "25 years ago, I attended a conference nestled in the tranquil North Georgia mountains, where our lodging was an old farmhouse converted into an inn. On that particular night, the inn was overbooked, leaving me to agree to sleep on a cot rolled onto the second-story veranda. Contrary to the norm, the evening remained devoid of any alcohol consumption, as we were informed by the front desk that there were no liquor stores within a 50-mile radius. Instead, a few of us engaged in a game of Trivial Pursuit before retiring for the night. It was during my slumber that I encountered an unsettling experience. Twice throughout the night, I found myself dreaming of an enraged young girl standing at the foot of my cot, vigorously shaking its frame. Initially dismissing it as an odd dream, the repetition of the experience on the second occasion left me unnerved. Morning arrived with my colleagues reporting disturbances from my room. Concerned, they described the cot shaking violently, prompting one to even check in on me, only to find me seemingly awake and untroubled. Strangely, I have no recollection of this encounter. As I recounted my bizarre dreams and the subsequent disturbances to my companions over breakfast, the inn's proprietor approached our table, inquiring if we had encountered her. It soon became apparent that my experiences mirrored those of previous guests, including sightings of the mysterious girl and unexplained disturbances at the same hour of the night. Despite the variety of responses I received when sharing this tale, ranging from skepticism to accusations of psychosis, I remained steadfast in my belief that the events were inexplicable but real. While I entertained thoughts of a supernatural warning or significance behind the encounter, I ultimately attributed it to the rearrangement of furniture, perhaps disturbing the restless spirit. Years later, another eerie encounter occurred during a fundraising event at the Charleston City Jail, a historically haunted site. Alone in a room, I felt an oppressive energy that compelled me to leave abruptly, reminiscent of the sensation one might experience atop the Eiffel Tower. Reflecting on these experiences, I've come to acknowledge the existence of inexplicable energies and phenomena beyond our understanding. Despite skepticism from some quarters, the prevalence of similar encounters among a significant portion of the population cannot be dismissed lightly. While I may never fully comprehend the true nature of these occurrences, I refuse to let ridicule or doubt diminish their significance in my own experiences. Back in the 1970s, we lived in a two-bedroom cottage that belonged to a neighboring family. They were great people. We knew members of their family quite well. We also knew that a brother, who was a dispatch rider in the Indian Army, had died in a tragic accident some years before. The house we moved into was vacant for many years and nobody told us the reason why. Our new landlords were keen to get tenants and reduced the rent considerably for us to take over. At first look, it was rundown and spooky. But being from a poor family with guts of steel, my dad taught us to rationalize all things that needed explanation, especially ones that dealt with supernatural ideas or stories. Lucky for us, I had developed an acute sense of perception from the time I was born. It came into good use when walking home late at night, walking through graveyards and listening to my dad explain the stars in the sky and the complex meanings of life. My dose of philosophy came in my early years. I also helped my dad carry his empty milk cans. At 15 years I was proud to be helping the family business. All was good for 2 years. And then, the trouble started. A fortune teller who played a small hand drum at 3 a.m. some mornings said aloud in the stillness of the night, "There is a spirit in this area and it will express itself soon. It needs to be let out of its cage." The Sadugudu man was a terrifying experience for a young lad more interested in girls than ghosts. I froze in my bed each time the Sadugudu man sang his evil futures. Tamilians will tell you of the Sadugudu man as an omen of bad luck. He was often described as a man who moved around in graveyards collecting hair and bone to concoct his magic potions. This potion was used in black magic. Soon after the Sadugudu man spoke his spirit words, the trouble began. At first, the windows rattled with no wind outside. Then the curtains blew around with windows shut. Doors opened and closed when tightly bolted. The sound of shrieking, birds calling, dogs barking, windows creaking, and those crazy, terrible screams that had no rational explanation whatsoever. What was this all about? I confronted my neighbor about these disturbances. She just blamed the wind and the trees around the house. Never once she explained what the real problem was. "Ah yes, the rent." My dad stayed cool. "It will all subside soon. Don't let the demons get you. Stay firm." The Sadugudu man kept coming every night for almost 2 months. We kids never saw him. We never knew what he looked like. He may have been a demon for all we know. The sound of his voice was terrifying. Then we heard him say that he was going to collect the spirit in a bottle and send it on its way. He announced he would come the following night at the same time. He arrived on the road above the house at 1 a.m. There were no passers-by at the time. We were inside the house and he warned us not to take a peep at him. "Just stay under your blankets," he warned. The exorcism began with a terrifying screech. The sound of motorbikes roared through the night. The screeching of brakes, police sirens, ambulance honks, and people crying covered the night. What was the Sadugudu man up to? The young dispatch rider of the cottage who met with the accident was wanting his flat back, we were told. But he was dead, we argued. Why would a dead person want the house back, we asked. Because he has something hidden under the floors maybe, or his death was a cruel twist of fate. He was about to get married 2 weeks before he passed away. The story told was both sad and disturbing. The spirit wanted us out of the house, the Sadugudu man prophesied on the last night. The next morning we approached the landlord. "Rubbish," she squealed at us. We returned for another restless night in the cottage. A little past midnight on the 8th night of terror, a small fire started at the end of the house. Quickly it spread through the ancient wooden rafters. At the same time, we heard the Sadugudu man, above the road, shouting at us to get out before the family was engulfed in flames. We ran outside in the cold night. The eerie flames of the fire spread rapidly down the corridors and consumed the first bedroom. We watched in terror as the fire took down the old wooden rafters and the old glass windows popped in the searing heat. Up on the road, the Sadugudu man was wailing. We could not see him, but we heard his voice distinctly. Next day, neighbors had gathered around telling us to stay away. "This is a cursed house. Find another house," they said. "Don't dare these spirits." "I got him. I got him, a faint figure shouted from the roadside that very same night. We strained our eyes in the direction of the voice. We could see nothing. The flames licked the fence where we thought the seductive voice came from. Still no sight of the man. Who was he? What did he get? Why did he come every day for 8 days and at a particular time to warn us? Did he really capture a spirit in a bottle or whatever? To this day I and my 5 brothers still wonder what really happened in that house. We have all spread out around the world to rebuild our lives from absolutely nothing but the shirts on our backs. We are all over 60 years now, and the voice of the seductive man still raises the hair on our necks. Was he sent in to capture the spirit he was after, or was he the accident victim himself? We have no answers. My aunt, a widow, resided in a secluded suburb, far removed from the hustle and bustle of city life. Her son, who had made his fortune abroad, had purchased a sprawling mansion for her to live in, a grand gesture of filial piety that spoke volumes of his love and devotion. However, despite the opulence of her surroundings, my aunt lived a solitary existence, her only companionship found in the occasional visits from family and friends. One such visit occurred after a long hiatus, when my aunt, feeling the weight of loneliness, decided to pay my mother a long overdue visit. Delighted by her presence, my mother implored her to stay for a few days, a request to which my aunt graciously acquiesced. It was during this time that my aunt expressed a concern about her empty mansion, nestled amidst the quietude of the suburb, and asked me to check on it in her absence. The task weighed heavily on my mind as I navigated through the chaos of my daily routine, the hours slipping away faster than I could manage. By the time I left work, the sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting the world into an inky darkness that matched the apprehension festering within me. Despite my weariness and the gnawing annoyance at the additional hour-long drive to my aunt's abode, I knew I had made a promise that I must keep. As I approached the secluded suburb, the familiar sights of civilization began to wane, replaced by deserted streets, shadowy alleys, and an eerie silence broken only by the soft hum of my car's engine. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky, its imposing facade sending a shiver down my spine as I pulled up to the gate. With trembling hands I fumbled for my mobile phone, relying on its feeble flashlight to guide me through the enveloping darkness. The foyer greeted me with a cold embrace as I groped for the light switches, illuminating the cavernous space with a warm glow that did little to dispel the sense of foreboding that hung heavy in the air. Each step I took felt like a journey into the unknown, the silence pressing in on me like the oppressive heat of a desert sun. I checked every window, every door, ensuring that they were securely fastened against the encroaching night. Yet, as I ascended the grand staircase to the second floor where my aunt's bedroom lay, a sense of unease gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. The tapping sound began then, a soft and rhythmic beat that seemed to echo through the empty halls, drawing me inexorably towards its source. I searched in vain for the origin of the noise, my heart hammering in my chest with each passing moment. But there was nothing to be found, no logical explanation for the haunting cadence that filled the air. With a mounting sense of dread, I made to leave, my mind screaming at me to flee from this place of shadows and whispers. Yet, as I reached for the light switch to extinguish the last vestiges of illumination, the tapping sound returned, louder now, more insistent, emanating from the depths of a wooden wardrobe standing sentinel in the corner of the room. For a moment, I hesitated, the rational part of my mind warring with primal fear as I grappled with the unknown. Was it a trapped animal, seeking escape from its wooden prison? Or something far more sinister, lurking in the shadows, waiting to ensnare its unwitting prey? In the end, it mattered not, for the instinct for self-preservation won out, and I fled from that cursed place with a speed born of desperation, the echoes of my footsteps mingling with the haunting rhythm of the tapping sound that followed in my wake. It was only when I reached the safety of the outside world, the cool night air washing over me like a benediction, which I dared to look back. And there, framed against the darkness of the mansion, was the faint glow of light from the second floor, a silent sentinel bearing witness to the horrors that lurked within its walls. And so, I fled into the night, haunted by the memory of that fateful encounter, forever tormented by the knowledge that some secrets are best left undisturbed, and that the darkness that dwells within the human heart is a far more terrifying adversary than any ghost or ghoul that prowls the night. I am a lucid dreamer. I have lucid dreams on a regular basis. I have heard of some people who can continue where they left off and stuff, but I wasn't as extreme. So, as some of you may know, with great power comes great responsibility. That responsibility, unfortunately, was sleep paralysis. You know where this is headed. So, I tend to get sleep paralysis once a month or so, and it is creepy. One of those horrible moments I will never forget. I was in bed, and had woken up from a lucid dream. I couldn't move. Oh Lord! I forced myself to stare at the ceiling, as I knew what would happen if I dared to look anywhere else. During this moment, I heard the door slammed shut, and somebody was sprinting. I looked. I had to look. I saw a small child with a machete. He had torn clothes, not to mention covered in a certain red substance. Shivers. He was sprinting toward me with that unforgettable smile on his face. I screamed. Thankfully I heard sound. I was lucky it wasn't real, and I got up. In the end, I think the lucid dreaming is worth it. Sleep paralysis or not. I am a man.